Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Professor Grimm, for this introduction. I'd like to thank ZIF and Professor Davy, Ulrika, and all other members of ZIF for inviting me here. It's indeed a pleasure to come back. I'm always on a plane flying to Germany, so if anybody ever asks me, are you going abroad, I say yes, and before I can say which country, they're saying, it must be Germany. So it's a second home to me. It has been a very pleasant return every time, and as I speak, it's 20 years since I first came to Germany. I have some of the longest friendships in this country. But it was very fascinating to be told that I was invited to talk on Warum Europa. And I said, you know, given that I think in English, I live and speak in English as we make fun in India, doing it in German würde ein bisschen schwierig sein. Ich habe gedacht, ich kann ja versuchen, aber also die Zeit ist es schon Abendbrotzeit in Indien, würde mal ganz schnell ins Bett gehen und ich habe gedacht, nee, ich mache das auf Englisch dann. Vielen Dank für Ihre Geduld. It's a very difficult act to follow a minister. You probably heard Europe the whole day today, and I think, what is it that I can tell you even more? You've heard a political, economic, legal, juristic, sociological interpretation of what is Europe. Is there anything more left to be said? And you know, as an academic, you just want to take on the next challenge. And I thought the next challenge was, what could I offer you from an intellectual exercise of why Europe? Especially when you've had a minister speak to you about Europe, and he says that, you know, that's the way we're going to go. So I thought the best way to do it was to play the devil's advocate and be provocative at this late hour, and I'm going to ask you to bear with me for the next 1 hour as we go through. I stand between you and the rest of the evening. I'm very aware of that. So how does one interpret and understand Europe? For me, as somebody who looks at Europe, and it was very interesting yesterday evening, we already had a little brief introduction from a dramatist, playwright, author, you name it, who looked at Europe and said how Europe had come home to her much long back, even as a young child. And probably for those living in Europe not aware of it, Europe does come home for a lot of us around the world in many different ways. English is a European language. And for Indians, it is a first language. I mean, we have 22 languages. Europe is much smaller as compared to that. If you think, you know, this 1 billion population has to talk to each other, we thank the British for that. At least they gave us some good things to work with. The rest, there is a little bit of problem. So when you look at Europe, I think it stands out in many ways. It's geography, it's politics, it's society, culture, economics, its values and ideas. I think it's more importantly for somebody who comes from an international politics background, Europe for me also stands and witnesses to be a geopolitical construct, which is unlike any other in Europe, in the world. It's also more increasingly, especially after 1992, it's an actor in international politics. For me, as a scholar at the university, it's also a discipline, it's a subject area that you want to engage and study. And I'm very happy to tell you, if I were to give you a report card on Europe, that at our university, which is, you know, we have one of the oldest European studies program, and with 5 faculty and 60 full-time researchers, Europe is doing quite well. Thank you. But more than that, I think Europe is an amalgamation of ideas. It's all of this and a lot more. It's extremely difficult to encapsulate in 40 minutes and tell you what Europe means. I think at the end of the day, what I took away listening from this morning was, it depends on where you stand. As you look at the stage, you see a different background behind me. I don't see the stage, I'm on the stage. But when I stand here and look at you, I see a multitude of faces and eyes looking at me and hearing me. And that's the biggest difference. Our locational context, drive, and how we make sense of Europe, how we relate to it, as an individual level, as somebody who's a lawyer, as somebody who's a citizen, next day going to buy a product. Does it have some European regulation attached to it? Europe is different things. And I bring to you 27 years of research engaging and looking at Germany and Europe in particular. I think, Ulrika, you couldn't have chosen a much better time to reflect on Europe and why Europe. And I think it's nice to look at 2014 as a standpoint of time and history and the intersection of politics. And I'm just going to do a quick rundown. I'm not giving you a history class over here. 1814, Congress of Vienna, 200 years since the transition of power began in Europe, something dramatic. 1914 was mentioned already today, World War I is 100 years. 1939, let's not forget, the Second World War, 75 years back from now. A New Beginning, 1957, Treaty of Rome, 2 years back, it was the 50th anniversary, 57, you had that, and then 55 years, 57 years now. 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 25 years. 1992, Maastricht Treaty, 22 years back. 2004, the EU enlargement, 10 years back. You look at it, in one way, there were different fault lines, and different fault lines have been overcome by this continuous moving forward which Europe has seen. There was a mention of the division of Yalta, and if you look at 2004, when Central and East European countries, 10 of them joined in, you could say the fault line of Yalta was finally overcome. The Central and East European countries had finally come home to Europe. In some ways, you could say that Europe has always been in transition. It has always been in change, but that change has been, as somebody from the outside looking at Europe, has been of many new ideas and concepts to build the world, to construct a Europe that in ways is going to be different from the past, and a future that binds economy, society, politics, and people. I think that at its very heart is the essence of what is Europe. Europe has also been the champion of rights, and it's not been a champion for only a select few. But the more important question to ask is, when you look at it with a lot of dismay and concern and say that Europe is heading nowhere, and I could offer you another picture of Europe. Europe is a land of retired people, aging demography, declining all kinds of indicators. Is it sunset for Europe? After all, there's a whole new world of rising Asia, emerging powers coming up, which has nothing to do whether English is spoken or not. The Chinese definitely may be aspiring to speak English, but they don't do that. But more importantly, in the long breadth of international politics, the reality is that no given state at any point in time will continuously rule the world, if that's what we're looking. International politics is about the rise and fall of states at any given point in time, and that's what you're experiencing. I think it would be a misnomer to even call it the emergence of Asia. It's the re-emergence of Asia that you see. Europe rose in between. I did point out I would be the devil's advocate. I'm doing that. So what happened to the winning edge of Europe? Each member today, as I look at it from outside and a perspective of an Indian looking at Europe, each member state looks at Europe with a different horizon today. There's a dispersion of the collective strength. One wonders, Project Europe cannot be on an auto mode. And that reminds me, I was once traveling in the US and, sitting next to a friend. I looked at a button which was there on the steering column. I said, what button is that? He said, oh, that's called cruise control. I said, oh, we don't have it in Indian cars. He said, when you're on the highway, the Autobahn, and you've got this nice speed and nothing's happening, you can press cruise control and sit back and relax, and the car will do it for you. I said, my God, in India, you're always on full control. There's never cruise control. It's chaos and mayhem. That's why we're alive. We don't allow it to go at all. So what's the problem with Europe? Is Project Europe? It can never be on auto drive mode. I think what's most important is that leadership is critical to the outcome today and in the future, and its ability to connect the idea with the people. What I intend to do in the next half an hour or so is lay out 5 different aspects of how I see why Europe needs a new collective enterprise. And when Ulrika asked me to join in, I thought, how would I title this? What would be my vision coming in from India to offer to you? And I said, it has to be about reimagining Europe. It is about an imagination of what can be constructed and done together. And this togetherness has to be a much larger together we than a very national we. So I said, it has to be reimagining Europe, a new contract of cooperation. Let me begin by addressing a bit from the past, and I said from past to a new future. After all, it was about forging a common destiny, and what we've heard today, the big I word, identity. I'm not taking a legal, jurisprudence, political point of view. I'm taking something which pulls up on all of this, because I think we've seen an interpretation of Europe today which argued to you from a rights point of view, from a legal point of view, the constructivist or the sociological point of view. And my intention is not to do that as I end today in the evening. I think I just want to offer you, what does it mean for somebody who is outside Europe, looking at all of you, placing you, so to speak, in the fishbowl and watching you swim every day? What does it seem? How do we look at it? And I think what stands out is the purpose of a common destiny and of a common identity. And both these things, of course, were created, very rightly so pointed out, with rules and treaties. Rules which tend to be rigid, which tend to be hard, and treaties which make it ironclad. I think that is the challenge of taking and constructing a common destiny. And let me quote Winston Churchill to you, what he said in 1946. The United States of Europe could, as if by a miracle, transform that turbulent and mighty continent. In this way only, he continued, will hundreds of millions of toilers be able to regain the simple joys and hopes which make life worth living. 46, Churchill also predicted in 45 that the Iron Curtain was coming down definitely on Europe. One could ask, where is that common purpose which brought the original six together in 1957? Has the collective vision been replaced by individual trajectories of growth and development? Has the vision fractured, and is it back to national thinking? After all, the journey from 1952, when the European Coal and Steel Community was made, till 1992, when the Treaty of Maastricht was signed, was one of an extreme historic significance. As Europe moved to further the idea of going beyond what we would call as a nation state, the rest of the world, ladies and gentlemen, was more engaged in the idea of nationalism. We in South Asia, and India in particular in 1947, was just becoming independent. I say that Europe has crossed the borders. In South Asia, we love our borders. We're willing to fight for it. So there's a difference thinking and a trajectory. On the occasion of the 55th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome, we had the Polish and the German foreign minister write an article in the International Herald Tribune in September 2012. And let me quote from that. We still stand by the Berlin Declaration that we signed on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Treaties of Rome. Let me emphasize, and I quote this again, we must always renew the political shape of Europe in keeping with the times. Europe is our common future. When you listen to those words, it resonates even more today at a time of crisis. Where is that common future? Where is that common purpose? 1952 and 57 brought a different kind of unity to a ravaged Western Europe, and the ability to dream differently as the rest of the world marched to the beat of nationalism. It was this collective leadership that forged a new vision for Europe, one of prosperity, of social justice, and of cohesion. All the speakers this morning have emphasized different aspects of Europe. I'm not getting into the bit-by-bit building of the European Economic Community to the European Union. But one thing is definitive if you track it. It was an elite-driven process. It was an idea driven up by leaders who thought, let us shape a new way of being together politically and economically in the western part of Europe. And to that extent, it was probably always set away and set aside the people who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of what Europe was creating together. And that's the question which has come back today in the form of the whole issue of the democratic deficit and the fact that do people feel commonly European enough? Where is it? If the past was about war and Europe had constructed a new identity, then definitely after the end of Cold War in 1990, one could see the transformation of Europe take place. I think the end of Cold War paved the way for a new integration push, which till that time was still limited to West European integration, and a whole new political and economic entity arose. It also meant it was the coming to home of Central and East European countries, a return to Europe, which was where they belonged, and there was no question of right or wrong about it. 2004, 10 years back, 10 countries joined, and one could ask, was it too much, too soon, too fast? The result, the political geography of Europe has changed dramatically. the new equations which have come up within the European Union is already indicating that there is a break in the partnership. Europe's diversity has increased a lot more than what was anticipated. More so, in 1992, when the Treaty of Maastricht was signed, Europe's ambition was redrafted and came ahead as a new way. It put together what is then called as the Common Foreign and Security Policy. If I were to say it in German, it's the Gemeinsame Außen- und Sicherheitspolitik, and if you abbreviate all the words, it means GASP. In English, you know what it means. For somebody who teaches European studies every day and I comment on European security, I'm really left gasping. There is no CFSP in action. Is it all bad? I think the problem lies in the fact that the pillar approach which was taken in the Maastricht Treaty, which emphasized intergovernmentalism as the method of coordinating political actorness, was bound to fail to deliver because nations, states, still held the final veto on foreign policy. In other words, the very political construct of the European Union, right from the beginning in 1992, followed two very different trajectories. The economic togetherness, which was emphasized by community law, and what you saw in the foreign and security policy area as intergovernmental. It also meant that Europe was growing internally at very different speeds. The idea that Europe as an entity, or the European Union as an entity, would be able to comprehensively deliver had different kind of capabilities and competencies to choose from, because it was not designed from the very beginning to be that way. We find that in contrast to the economic construct of the EU, you find that at the political and the foreign policy level, it's not a cohesive EU actor that you get. In fact, even the economics hid the fact that there was too much of diversity and that the well-being of all member states was not at the same level. This vast diversity of economic health was just waiting to explode as the EU moved towards further integration and a common currency without a common fiscal policy. If any, it was a political decision without the rational economic basis. We heard the minister say that one could not have waited for it. So, at the end of the day, what did you get? You had a crisis which was waiting to happen. But is it really all gloom and doom? As I looked down to my next point, and I thought, what would be it? How did Europe move from there? If you look at the headlines today, it says that Europe has moved from the crisis point, it has turned the corner, growth is back. Well, that's good. If Europe has passed the crisis and is moving forward, the response will now be critical to what will follow collectively for Europe and individually for each country. But in real terms, the crisis is not over. It has evolved from a banking crisis to an economic crisis, more acutely to a political crisis, and at the level of the common citizen, to an acute crisis of not being able to identify with Project Europe, which was launched in 1957. In fact, if you were to cut away the countries, remove the terms, one would think that you were actually talking of a north-south confrontation. That is something what you heard in terms of the new economic discourses which came up in the late 70s and 80s. We have a new north-south equation, and it is about an equation which exists within Europe. We are talking about the highest rates of unemployment in Europe's recorded history. In fact, it draws attention to the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that there is no one Europe you can talk about. There are multiple Europes. There is a Europe of prosperity, there's a Europe of austerity, there's a Europe of jobs, and a Europe of unemployment, one of hope, another of hopelessness, of nationalism, and of collective visions. More importantly, as one looked at the decisions which came out of Brussels over the last 3 years when the crisis hit, you were offered an alternative which was very different to what Washington was thinking in terms of the crisis. Here, jobs and growth were juxtaposed by austerity and recession. The more important point is, what does Europe offer to its people who are confronted with one of despair and hopelessness? What does Europe, in terms of collective leadership, offer to the young when it says that there will be more years of unemployment? How will political leadership take their own people and Europe collectively is of paramount importance today. Does the political leadership have the courage and the ability to be bold and think outside the box? What is the image of Europe in each of the member states of the EU? Is there really a collective vision of Europe? Is a question which needs to be asked. It brings me to the fourth point of my presentation to you, and that is to ask, when we have looked at all these issues, is there a new contract required? And before that to ask, has the old contract broken down? Where is the collective vision? I was very fortunate to host the former Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson at the university and then privately meet him a couple of times for lunch and dinner when he visited India. And he was talking about the right choices that leadership has to make. More importantly, he was talking about the choices which you make when you are in office. The difference between what I would call as being a politician and as being a statesman. Göran Persson said that there was a point given as finance minister and subsequently as prime minister where he had to make a very tough choice between what was good for Sweden as a country and what was good for him as a politician. Should he stay in office till the next election, which all of us like to do, after all we are human? Or should he take a decision which will benefit the country, but which would mean a political sunset for him? And Persson said that he decided he has to do what was good for Sweden, but which was going to be bad for him politically. He lost the elections, but he was able to put Sweden on the road of economic growth and health. And I think that is a critical question that all leadership collectively will have to ask in Europe. Europe's collective decision-making today is far removed from the feelings on the street to the decisions which specially emanate from Brussels. If economic choices push more young people into unemployment, is that not a violation of human rights which the EU likes to tell the rest of the world? Europe has presented to the world an image of a normative power. It endorses democracy, rule of law, human rights, and the market, the four things which make up the Copenhagen criteria, which is critical for any European country wanting to join the EU. What happens when you don't meet the criteria within? Who will punish you? The people of Europe. I think what is important to reiterate over here is that one of the most significant things of being European was there was always a diversity of practices which was available. Constructing Europe did not mean that the differences went away. Perhaps there was a pushing away of the old in the construction of the new. The economic crisis of a few countries that has got the label of a Eurozone crisis is probably a misnomer. There is nothing wrong with the euro. It's a strong currency. It continues to be the second largest global reserve currency, but there was a problem in a select few countries with their debt. The heart of the European project or the contract has been about sharing the burden. What happens in 2014 when nationalism overtakes this collective project? What happens when European integration, which is a reality, which is the future of every European country over here, depends on it, is suddenly questioned? It's not a question only of the Constitution, but it is also an issue of solidarity in the European experience, and my previous speakers have both drawn attention to it. There is without fail a new political equation which has emerged in Europe, an equation which sees a standoff for cooperation as seen from the outside and for less to be done sometimes from some countries. And central to taking this leap forward is the need to put collective above national interest. Which brings me to the last point of my talk, which is, how does one reimagine Europe? Can you have a new contract of cooperation? I think listening to the speakers before me this morning and this entire day, it was very clear that Europe finds itself at crossroads. It either undertakes a collective action or takes responsibility and fosters a political, democratic union, or falls over and disintegrates. I don't think the last is an option which can be exercised by anybody. You can present many arguments. You could give a legal argument, a political argument, a rights-based argument as to why it will happen or it will not happen. I'm just going to borrow from my previous speaker, Professor Halton. You spoke about the yes, we can moment for Obama when he came and tested foreign policy in Berlin. And Berlin is such a favorite with the Americans. Ich bin ein Berliner, we've heard all that. We've heard the Kennedy moment, we had the Obama moment, right? But you also said that Obama was not speaking English, and I will come to that. But I will, just drawing attention to that, I want to come back to it a little later. It is a powerful moment when a leader from across the Atlantic, which is part of the transatlantic partnership, comes to claim a part of Europe as collective heritage. I think that was a powerful moment. It's about linking futures of commonality. And you saw how quickly this commonality was put to test when America announced its new pivot to Asia. When America said it's rebalancing and it's going to the Asia Pacific, Europe said, are we going to be left alone, right? So the notion of the collective does exist, and it always seems to be driven by crisis, and that's the problem over here. Does Europe need another new crisis to design a grand bargain or a new contract at the European level? But maybe a differently enabled contract, a new contract among the European players that can bring people together for a better, peaceful, and a democratic future. None of it is new. If one reads the opening lines of the Treaty of Rome written in 1957, it was well thought out. What happened since 57 to today is the journey has taken a very different turn, as structurally international politics has got transformed. The end of Cold War has meant that the glue which held the Europeans together is no longer there. That nationalism which was tucked away and put together in some ways or coming to a common understanding has been allowed to flourish and come back again. Europe is rediscovering some ways its past, but with dangerous consequences. Seen from the outside, it is very clear that Europe needs a political innovation that can transcend the status quo today. It needs, more importantly, an emotional connect with people who find that they are not heard in Brussels. Don't worry, even New Delhi and Brussels don't hear each other. What then are the possibilities for Europe to forge a new contract and a new cooperation, one that is more inclusive and that is more visionary as well? I think at the heart of it is both single and collective leadership. There is a strong need for a very strong political will to be able to make a difference to the journey of Europe. And as we speak, I know this is not part of the mandate. It's not about talking about where Germany is, but I couldn't resist the argument. Germany and its leadership in this moment of crisis is something which has come periodically under a lot of waiting and watching. What will Germany do? We had the pleasure and the honor at my university to be able to host the German president more recently in February this year. And the German president was indicating that Germany should do more. It's coming out of the Munich Security Conference. It was very interesting coming to India all this way. He was once again reiterating that Germany should do a lot more. You say that, and immediately, of course, history starts reverberating very fast, very soon. What does Germany do more? Take on international responsibility and intervene. Where? One doesn't know. But yes, watching Europe, in particular, and Germany even more so, the question has been that a new core and periphery has emerged in Europe. The crisis has brought forth that there is a growing dynamics between two Bs, Brussels and Berlin. And then who shall succeed in this Brussels and Berlin dialogue? As I said, Ulrika, I was stepping out of my mandate. It is not to be talking about German leadership over here, but you can't talk about Europe and the construction of the European Union by forgetting that the heart of building ECSC in 1952 and the Treaty of Rome in 1957 was to harness Germany and bring it into an institutional framework. German foreign policy from the time of Adenauer has been about multilateralizing German interest within a larger collective European interest. So here is the argument being presented, and one sees it from the outset, that Germany needs to do a lot more. There appears sometimes, when you look at what is coming out of Berlin and in terms of what comes out of Brussels as well, that there is a finger pointing at those countries which have defaulted, which have not performed well. Somebody had a lot of time on their hands, ladies and gentlemen, to take all these countries which are defaulting and having a severe crisis with their public debt and play them around and come up with a beautiful acronym which is called PIGS. Believe me, this, in the animal world, they're not very happy. First, they have a viral infection named after them. It's swine flu, and now they're called pigs. I think there must be something telling over there. Well, anyways, when you look at these countries and the finger pointing which has been done and what they're doing or not doing and the tightening of the belt, there appears to be collective amnesia. It's not long back. We're in 2014. 2003, pick up the headlines. Just track them and look at what was happening in Europe. Who do you think was called the sick man of Europe? It's none other than Germany. Who do you think defaulted on the criteria which was laid down? France and Germany. Who do you think presented what should be done? The European Commission. Who do you think overruled it? The powerful countries. It should ring a bell. You cannot have a finger pointing done when you yourself have violated the criteria which you put in. It was a crisis waiting to happen. You have set the precedent. Default, you will be delivered. The others are going to follow. It's a hard task. It's a hard task when you look at it and say that no, our economy is performing well 11 years down the road, but amnesia, my dear friends, is extremely dangerous. And a collective amnesia to think that others should be reminded that they have a duty to do so as to be good Europeans is even more dangerous. I come back to the point, Professor Halton spoke about the yes we can moment in Berlin and Obama not belonging to Europe. Let's not forget who has guaranteed the peace of Europe. Yes, the European pays, but America stays. I think that at heart is why European prosperity took place in the first place. I'm willing to take on any counter-arguments that any of you have. As I conclude, I have 3 points to say. First, I think it goes without saying that there are multiple Europes. For those looking at Europe from the outside, Europe's remarkable recovery post-war, its ability to transcend the borders, its ability to cast a common future in which prosperity was at the heart of the project, and politics was brought together under the mantle of extremely visionary leadership, seems to be challenged today. For somebody who has been looking at Europe for over a quarter century, I would say nothing wrong in Europe. After all, every crisis leads to something better. Europe has always bounced back, coming back stronger and sharper maybe. I don't know if lean and mean is something which we could apply to it, but yes, definitely bounding back from every crisis. The important question to ask is, should Europe always wait for a crisis for it to respond? Right? I mean, the 3 kinds of leadership. You could either be proactive, like the Americans. You can invoke imminent threat to world peace, and you can go out and save the world, as the Americans continuously love to do, and foreign policy never learns. Second, you can be, waiting and watching. And the third is you can react. Maybe there's something common between India and Europe in some ways. We both are very reactive. The Indians also love to wait and watch. We've also, made it a masterful art. We say even silence is a positive attribute. So maybe there's something common. We should share notes on that. But Europe can't wait for the next crisis to come. The next crisis could be too big and too large and too diverse in terms of the voices which are within. And more importantly, as the next generation which is enjoying the fruits of benefit of what has been created in the past, Europe has become, in that sense, a common idea in which they can freely move around. There is a whole Erasmus generation which moves around without borders. There is one common currency and you can enjoy the benefits of Europe. But they've lost the history of Europe. We are losing a generation. There was earlier a gentleman over here who was telling about, witnessing 1951. We are losing generations who were connected to history and to the past in more intimate ways. We are raising a generation which does not have a historical connection to their past. In that sense, it's a grievous offense. Because if you take the peace of Europe for granted, you are pushing Europe only towards one direction, and that is crisis. If you forget the past, and you forget how difficult it has been to construct a common future, then there is only one direction in which you're going in this car, and that is towards one of crisis. And that's something which the European project has done. It's gone too far away from its people. It's too elite-driven. It's unable to explain. The model is flawed. Yes, we could get into the legal part of it. We could get into, the rights part of it. What happens? But what do you do when you've constructed the model? You have to see that how is it that you can take it along? Can you make it more inclusive? Right? Why is it that people feel it is so distant? People feel even with their national governments it is distant. And as we get into the parliamentary elections, today is the last day of April, we get into May. It's election fever all around in India as well. We decide everything democratically, unlike our neighbor China. So I would like to, 2 minutes blurb of inviting all of you to India and watch how democracy takes place in India. We learned it from Europe. So it is extremely important as we teach and talk and philosophize and talk about Europe to understand that the future belongs collectively where it is made, that is, with the people. But you have to explain the European project. I mean, I remember meeting a French couple during the referendum, and they said, imagine in the morning you got 2 copies of the Constitution. So you get up and make your coffee and you say, darling, did you read Article 44? Is that the kind of conversation people understand? Europe is far away if that's the way you're going to make it happen. So why is Project Europe so distant from the people is something I think which needs to be examined. Second, I think history weighs extremely heavily on Europe, on some countries more than the others. You cannot pat yourself on the back and say we are good and let others do the same hard work. I think when you look at the past and how the other countries came by and stood next to certain European countries, then one has to have a collective way of sharing the burden. You can't escape it. Let me quote, finally, a line which I've taken from Karl Popper. It has to do with optimism. And we have a saying in India. We say, after all, everything rests on the one word, and that is hope. You hope that tomorrow will be better, tomorrow will bring you something good. Of course, in our Indian Hindi language, it can be a little confusing sometimes because the word for yesterday and tomorrow is the same word. It tells you about the cyclical nature of time, and the only way of recognizing that is by knowing the tense of the sentence. Was it yesterday, past tense, or future? But it tells you what matters is the present. So I quote Karl Popper, and he said, "It's a moral duty that the future," he wrote, "depends on what we do. We bear every responsibility. It's our moral duty not to predict evil, but to fight for a better world." Ladies and gentlemen, is Europe collectively ready to fight for a common and collective future? Thank you.